Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon. Well, here we are in America, entering our 9th month, maybe our 8th month of the coronavirus pandemic. And it's still no end in sight. There are 7.5 million people who have come down with the coronavirus, 210,000 people, and streaming towards who knows. So every time we open these up, we started going online with the Myth Salon when we had the coronavirus in March. And there's a moment of reflection at the very beginning that we really want to give patience. We want to think about those that we've lost. There are brothers, sisters, parents, relatives, friends. So for them and for all of the people who are around us and surviving, let's give a moment of silence, please. I was brought to our guests today, Clay Boykin and Dennis Tardan, through my good friend, Gard Jameson. And we were working on a project about Nicholas Roerich, and he was interviewed by Clay and Dennis. He sent me the video. We ultimately talked, and they actually interviewed me. It was a delightful experience. But in the course of this meeting, in the course of developing the project for Gard, I became aware of this fellow who was the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I'm going to try his name, Rabindranath Tagore. That wasn't bad. And in 1913, he won. He was primarily a lyricist, and he's been widely acclaimed for introducing the idea of the lunar masculine. So I'm not going to read the short essay that I had, but I will read a poem by him. And I want you to just hear the words and hear his intent. One day in spring, a woman came in my lonely woods, in the lovely form of the beloved, came to give to my songs melodies, to give to my dreams sweetness. Suddenly, a wild wave broke over my heart's shores and drowned all language. To my lips, no name came. She stood beneath the tree, turned, glanced at my face, made sad with pain, and with quick steps came and sat by me. Taking my hands in hers, she said, "You do not know me, nor I you. I wonder, how could this be?" I said, "We two shall build a bridge forever between two beings, each to the other's unknown. This eager wonder is at the heart of all things." The essay that he has uses the words lunar masculine. And on the occasion today of the harvest moon, which those of you who know me know I feel every month at the full moon, I have these incredible sensations of tides rushing and pulses pulsing. And it just, I have to be very careful in terms of being reactive. I'm not usually able to do something. I'm not usually able to be so reflective. So let's go to the Myth Salon. I want to turn this over to my good friend and colleague and co-founder in the Myth Salon, Dr. Will Linn, and let him introduce the panelists and our featured guests today. And let's learn a little bit about what it's in store for us in search of the new compassionate male. Will?
Thank you, Dana. You know, I'm thinking as we start to talk about the lunar, many of you have seen in the newsletter this segment called Left Eye. And this is all built around the notion of the lunar eye. And in that segment, in the description of what that segment's about, which all that is this is the stuff we want to point to, the stuff we want to promote, right? The stuff what we want to do is reflect on it and share it in reflection. So the left eye, the lunar eye, is something that reflects instead of shines. It doesn't give forth its originating light, like the sun originates the light. The moon receives and reflects the light. And so as we talk about the lunar masculine, I thought I'd share, I haven't even mentioned or described where this lunar left eye came from. I thought I'd take a chance to share that that's the purpose, that's the idea. And I suspect that as we move into the conversation tonight about the compassionate male, that many of us will be in this kind of same place where we're hesitant to assert, to originate the light about what we're trying to say. Many of us are going to want to reflect on what this is. And so perhaps a conversation of mirrors. To get us started, of course, you know, Dr. Dana White, scholar, author, host of this Myth Salon, adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Will Linn. I lightly moderate these Myth Salons. My PhD is in myth. I've spent years working for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and building an academic department for filmmakers at what's now called Hush College. We're also joined by Selina Matthews, who's a clinical psychologist, author, and keynote speaker who graduated from Pacifica and has been an ever-present participant and supporter of the Myth Salon. Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, I happen to have his book very close to me a lot lately. Mythology scholar, poet, longtime professor in Pacifica's Myth program, and author of An Obscure Order, Reflections on Cultural Mythologies. We also have Vorris Nunley, a professor of rhetoric and philosophy at UC Riverside and author of Keeping It Hush, The Barbershop and African-American Hush Harbor Rhetoric. And we have Zaman Stanizai, a professor of mythology and political science at Pacifica and Cal State, a poet, linguist, mystic, and Fulbright scholar. And joining us tonight is David Huff, who we know, a friend of ours, mythologist, filmmaker, student of Dennis Slattery's, and confidant of Dana White's, representing boldly the Southern United States tonight as we discuss the compassionate male. And joining us tonight, Clay and Dennis. Clay is a former U.S. Marine Corps officer and corporate change agent with a deep-seated belief in servant leadership. He founded the Men's Fellowship Network Circles of Men Project in 2012. He's facilitated hundreds of weekly circles, has led workshops and given seminars in North America and Africa, and has helped thousands of men learn about self-compassion and grow along their life journey. Dennis is an interviewer, communications coach, and documentarian. For more than 40 years, Dennis has worked as a television interviewer and documentary producer and corporate communications coach for companies like such as Shell, Farmers Insurance, Conoco, Phillips, Siemens, Rice University, and many others. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Clay and Dennis tonight. Thank you for coming on to talk with us about the compassionate male. I hope that we will dig into our ongoing theme, which is COVID 2020 and where we are today. So thank you for joining us and looking forward to the conversation.
It is our pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for allowing us to be here tonight. Over the course, I'm 72 years old this year, and I grew up in the South and grew up all in the white male privileged experience. And I always wanted to do something that was powerful, that was impactful, that could truly make a difference in the world. And as we all know, that can only happen one way, is that starting with me and then moving out. But as I did this and I got to Austin and I worked and was continuing to do my interviewing, I met Clay Boykin and found out that in his work, he was in search of the new compassionate male. this new archetype, this opportunity that was going to grow, because whatever was working or had been working or was possibly working but no longer working was gone. Nature abhors a vacuum. It must be replaced. After my friendship and my brotherhood with Clay, I have learned and grown and began to explore and search of the new compassionate male inside myself, and then to step out with him in our podcast and the work that we're doing. We're going to begin by letting you know Clay's story, because to hear Clay's story is going to give you a grounding in what we want to hear from you tonight, because we need your feedback. We need to know where you've walked. We need to know where you felt. We need to know where you're growing.
Mandala, the Sanskrit word for circle. A circle designed to have meaning of a cosmic order. This is my mandala, my life in symbols, in sacred geometry. In the relationship, in the white spaces between the words. Created and recreated over many years. Growing in depth and breadth as I grow. A reflection of my expanding consciousness. Enfolded within the universal circle, revealing who I truly am. Pulling all the scattered aspects of my life together, one tiny pencil stroke at a time. Here I find my center, knowing that I will create it again and again as I evolve and grow with time. This is my mandala.
Clay, would you begin your story, please?
Sure. Thanks, Dennis. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And like Dennis said, we're here to share and to learn. There's so much wisdom around this panel and in the audience. That's just a tremendous opportunity for us. And so thank you, Dana. Thank you, Will, and everybody. So a brief overview of me. I was a very creative child, and very much in my heart as a young boy. And for various reasons growing up, I lost that and lost trust in adults, especially men. And went on through school and picked up a responsibility in my senior year in high school, senior year, a sense of responsibility that I follow in my father's footsteps. He was in World War II in Europe and served. And I said, you know, I really need to serve some myself to honor him and to do my part for the country. And I also wanted to pay for my own school since we didn't have a lot to live on. And so I did that by taking a Marine Corps scholarship. Not an intent to spend a career there, but to do my 4 years. That's what the patriarchy did. I put my heart, my creative stuff to the side. I said, you can't earn money, you can't be responsible, you can't grow in this, you know, and do what you're supposed to do as a man. And that was my adolescent or my teen way of thinking about things. So I went through the Marine Corps, and what I came out with, and I think about it every day, was the whole idea and concept of servant leadership. That's where my passion is. That's where my heart is. And so I found that in going in through the Corps and into business, that servant leadership was the thread, and that was what I could bring into the corporate world. The problem was that we were running fast and hard, and climb the ladder is what we do in internal competition and traveling. I was in the technology sector and traveled the world. As Edna St. Vincent Millay said, and this was what I lived by for a long time, it was, my candle burns at both ends. It may not last the night, but oh my friends and oh my foes, it gives a lovely light. So that was how I went at it. Let's go for it. And in the process, I really, really wore myself down. I was depressed for years, anxiety, that whole cycle. And it really took its toll on me to the point that in 2007, when I was 53, I was in Jamaica on vacation. I was in the woods with my Swiss Army knife doing crafts, realizing now that my heart was talking to me and I was about to have a heart attack. As long as I was calm, I was okay. And so I didn't say anything, and I sat with it for 3 days, didn't say anything to the family. But I found this place of peace because I knew that this was my last day. And all of a sudden, just this whole weight of the world was off my shoulders, and it's a peace that's hard to describe. And I sat there doing my arts and crafts, what was in my heart to do. Well, we got home, and 5 bypasses later, a heart attack when I got to the hospital, and 5 bypasses later, I survived and went on. Well, that was close to 2008. The market was crashing. I was commuting back and forth to New York City. My office was on Park and 32nd Street. And sure enough, I convalesced the end of the year, and then I got laid off as everyone was downsizing. So I was the warrior out there, first in the Corps and then the business world. That's what I did. This was the first time I was unemployed since I was 16, and I panicked. And for the next 2 years, I went deep into the dark night of the soul, barely an interview. And it took its toll on me. Eventually, I realized that something's really got to change. I found work, but I still had this void inside of me. And for 5 years, I wandered around. And at the time, I didn't know Joseph Campbell. I didn't know Hero's Journey. But these are things that I was going to be learning along the way. And so in 2012, actually it was 2010, I went back to church, to a New Thought church, no judgment, everybody's there to heal. And that's what I needed at the time. And I began to wake up and to come back. I eventually became a prayer chaplain. And the funny thing was that, we'd sit there, I'd mind map and make notes in church and cry, all the healing. Everybody cried in church at some time. But one day, Reverend Steve was talking and going on like he would usually do, a wonderful guy. And he said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't have to build a condo there." And it was like, oh, I've got a choice. So that was kind of a turning point for me and a real eye-opener. I became a prayer chaplain there, and then a year later, realizing that for me to really grow this mistrust of men that I grew up with, I needed to wade into it because, you know, I'd recovered and I organized religion was okay, you know, but I really to really learn, I really needed to learn how to connect with other men. So my means of doing that was to start my own men's circle, and it was counterintuitive the way we did it because I wasn't going to go join a typical men's group. We did more of a contemplative circle. There was no judgment. We actually called it a network and a gathering instead of a meeting, and topics of conversation and so forth. Over the next 8 years to today, I've found trust in other men. It's become my passion, and when my book came out in the summer of 2018, in the very beginning of it, it says I'm dedicating the next 20 years of my life to the spiritual growth of men. A few months later, I quit work, and sure enough, I did, and things began to unfold. So it brings us up to where we are now. The 2 years roughly from there till now, what really became the common theme, and I was working across the United States, and I worked for several weeks over in Kenya, meeting with men, workshops, retreats, and so forth. And the whole idea of compassion just kept coming up for me. That this void that every man has got in his heart, that the patriarchy has us pushed down, it's going to come out. Either it's going to come out in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. For me, it was a heart attack. Thank goodness I survived. But the ability to open up, to integrate, and right in there is what's innate in all of us, is the spark of compassion. And so as this came along, I said, you know, I really believe that as this change is happening that we've been talking about for, gosh, you know, years and years and years, that I really do believe that out there, there's a spark of compassion that's awakening in every man. And he may not realize that that's what it is. It's a burn, you know, there's something, but he knows what's right. And the patriarchy is pushing him down. He's going to break out of that. So from my vantage point, if I can point there and say, a new compassionate male is the new archetype, and we all have it within us. And I say male and not man, because the divine masculine within women. Okay, so the new compassionate male, everybody's included. But if we can aim at that, you know, everyone in their own way can define it. You know, king, warrior, magician, lover, that's all there, all valid. But to me, the common thread amongst all of them is compassion. You know, Karen Armstrong talks about that. All the major religious traditions in the world have the golden rule, said in many different ways. But the essence of the golden rule is compassion. So that's where we are now. And, you know, I'm writing a book, and I sat on it for a long time saying, you know, the new compassionate male, well, when am I going to figure that out? And what I realized, and Dennis helped me with this, I'm not going to be able to write that book, but I'm in search of the new compassionate male. And so every opportunity to engage, like tonight, is an opportunity for me to learn, for Dennis and I to learn what that really means. To put it into context, I don't have but barely a scratch of the surface of what mythology is about, and putting archetypes into it. But this is a feeling that I've got. So that's why I'm excited about us being here, because I want to mix it up. I really would like to have a lot of conversation about it. Help us shape this. Guide us along the way. And with that, Dennis, did I forget anything?
I don't think so, Clay, because that's exactly what we're hoping for. we need your insights. We need your experience on how this word compassion that I grew up with as being a very soft, passive word is nothing like that to me. It is an active noun. It is strong. It is something that fulfills me. It's something that empowers me. And I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear from your experiences. We would love to hear from how you feel, how you are experiencing this in your lives, and what you feel this new archetype, because in this time of COVID, when all of us have had to be extraordinarily introspective, I had my very first human contact besides my wife in 6 months when I ran into a friend at the grocery store and we just touched elbows.
Mm-hmm.
And as everyone that knows me knows I'm a hugger, that's been an extraordinary change. But what we've ended up doing, what we've ended up in this world, in this COVID world, is finding out a lot more about who we are, and having to be very introspective and not liking everything that I see in me, of course, but in the part of this to be growing and to be learning. So that's where we want to turn it over to the rest of you, and please help us talk about your experience with compassion, your experience with how compassion is growing within you, and how you have grown along your life, and how you see it is an important ingredient so that we can figure out how to put it into the frameworks that we're working on.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Clay, for sharing your very moving story. I'm certainly not any kind of expert on this topic, but I find that once I feel like I understand something, I kind of stop talking about it. So I'll probably talk too much about this because I am trying to figure it out. And one thing that I'm just catching what you heard is you're talking about what the patriarchy did to you, which can be very jarring to somebody who naturally aligns men with the patriarchy, right? So the first thing that's really interesting is a clear separation of men from the patriarchy, and from that potential projection onto men as, the agents of the patriarchy. A real interesting reframing that happens there, and it runs alongside another one, which is a big mistake people make of the hero complex and the hero's journey. The hero complex is what I would say is somebody who thinks I'm a hero, right? But normally that's the one that's doing it for themselves. And then eventually, of course, as you reach this place of compassion, what I would say is that the hero's journey requires the death of the hero complex, the integration of compassion in order to become the hero. And so a couple things I really appreciate is that there are a couple places where we can get fuzzy that are really damaging to heroes and to men when they get the projection of a hero complex and of patriarchy. And so it's really interesting and really moving to hear you make those distinctions. And I'm wondering if that's something that you find you have to do in your men's groups.
I'm so appreciative of you saying that, because I work and collaborate with an organization called Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, and they've been at it for 28 years, 10 countries, and there are about the deep healing between women and men. The fact that men are wounded by the patriarchy as well as women, and to be able to come together and to recognize that, not to compare wounds, but to recognize that our common ground is that we're both wounded, that the patriarchy got us here, good and bad. And now it's time to move forward from there. And the healing between women and men is so important. And that recognition is very key to moving forward. So I appreciate you calling that out.
And that integration is, the healing of men and women, of course, also being an externalization of the inner healing of the self, the inner and inner masculinity.
That's right.
We're really trying to integrate, and what you're saying echoes so much from the individuation, so much from the hero's journey, where what we have is some kind of, to get where we were, to become adults, we had to push down a lot of the other stuff. And eventually when we become adults, we're going to look around and be like, wait a minute, I'm not fulfilled. Where's the rest? And thus something happens.
Yeah. When just one more thing about the gender equity stuff. we have a time to share our stories. And for most of us, we're sharing at a deep enough level that it's something we've never shared with another being. And for me to stand up and said, look, I'm a privileged white Western male. I've got everything going for me. But let me share my wound. What happened to me, these things. It's not pity, but to see the women in the circle almost throw back that their stereotypical privileged white Western male is wounded too. I hadn't thought about that. And again, it's not to compare, but to recognize that we're really on common ground here if we can arrive at that understanding, knowing, and let the alchemy bring the respect that's due both of us.
I love that the sense here, as you have said, Will, is that it's the system, it's the patriarchy that is what is not functioning. And it is not functioning and is dysfunctional for all of humanity. In this quantum world where everything is interconnected, where we can no longer depend upon a hierarchy to be able to get us to where we're going, where synergy, where 1 + 1 must be greater than 2. The patriarchy cannot take us there. We need new archetypes, we need new models, we need all of us showing up.
You may have even answered the questions getting ready to ask, Dennis and Clay. Thanks for sharing your story. Patriarchy is a big word, and I have some ideas of what that might mean, but help flesh out for me what you mean by patriarchy for yourselves, and then as you see that as a dominant system, it sounds like that we're under, and what we'll be moving towards. But can you flesh out what you guys mean by patriarchy?
I see the patriarchy as being a hierarchical system with the man at the top that was instilled at the man at the top, and that everything goes down. They will then translate down to other people in order to follow their dictates, and that this is the system that we created, and it got entrenched, and then once it got entrenched, we began to have to protect it. And after it did, and the world got so complex that it can no longer work. But I simplify it in that way, David.
Yeah, and male domination institutionalized throughout, gender, race, politics, economics, and it's where I think we've put ourselves ecologically in the world. Yeah, and it's man from here up, and unfortunately, much less here, and that's been driven by survival of the fittest early on. But we've evolved, and there's a better way.
We had this question come up in the opposite form when we had Maureen Murdoch here talking about the heroine's journey. And the question is, well, what is feminine? If it's not woman, how do we come at even what it is? And, I ended up sending an email to Chris Downing because I was pretty stumped. And, what she was kind of saying, there are a lot of answers, a lot of ways to come at that answer. And with patriarchy, maybe not a conclusion, but everything, I think that the simplest thing is that it's a repression of what we think of as traditional feminine values from the system of values. And so then what do you define as traditional feminine values? Well, then we have to go through that. Is that we come at them from the body, we come at them from myths, we come at them from cultural norms, whatever. Some of them may be objective, some of them may be subjective, some of them may be cultural. But when we kind of add up this really fuzzy thing, I think that we all can kind of agree that there's been that part of the masculine, hyper-masculine consciousness is a little less feeling, a little bit more impervious, more of a hunter than a nurturer, maybe more of a killer than a birther, and so we could go around the room and start to tack these on, but I might frame it by suggesting that it's, first of all, matriarchy is still hierarchy. It's just a different type of hierarchy, but patriarchy is a hierarchy that is not allowed in what it identifies as feminine values.
Let me play devil's advocate around hierarchy, because I'm hearing hierarchy is an issue here. What about folks that feel a sense of security and their place in the world within a hierarchy? That structure They know who's above them. They know who's below them. It provides them a sense of who they are in the world, and then a lot of security around it. So I'm thinking, I mean, I hear where hierarchy can be damning and hurtful, but I also see many examples. I mean, I live across the street from a Catholic church, which is very hierarchical. And it's a place of great meaning for the people that go there.
Mm-hmm.
During COVID, they've set up icons for folks to come in the parking lot and pray and meditate. That's a very hierarchical organization, and one might say a very masculine hierarchy, but it works seemingly well. It's not my thing.
I'm going to go back to the 80s and my time in the corporate world. And we had the debate going, and the whole sector would organize differently. We would be organized this way, then this way, and this way, and this way. And it got down to be, are we going to be hierarchical or are we going to be project driven? And they went back and forth and back and forth. And I was up there going, well, wait a second. We're intelligent enough that it's not either or, it's a yes and. The hierarchy does provide a place to come home to roost, to do the things that are necessary there. But the way we get things done is a task organization where, you know, David, you're the leader of this team on this project over here, and I work for you. I'm the leader for this project over here, and you work for me on my team. And so it's a yes and. I don't think it's this or that, because there's absolute benefit. I think there's necessity in both working together.
Totally agree, Clay. And David, I love what you said, because it's that there is an option to it, that we have an option, that if the hierarchy serves you, if serving in that hierarchical structure serves you, wonderful. There is an option. There are options. And that's what we didn't have. When I was growing up, there was not an option except to be a certain way. That was the way it was. I did not know that there was an option to be a man in many different ways. I did not know that, and that is what we're learning and growing, is that there are options. And if that works, or in what I'm seeing in the communication I'm doing around the world, is that we're going into a nodal. We've gone from that hierarchical to the nodal, where when I was growing up, they had a show called Mission Impossible, where Jim Phelps would get a mission from the secretary, and you'd pull out the dossiers of these 4 people, and then they'd go and do that mission. Well, that's very much the way we are doing now. We're getting people together just in time and then dispersing. So it's a different way of thinking, but the hierarchy will always be part.
I would just suggest that the nervous system depends on both. The central nervous system is fundamentally hierarchical, and the peripheral nervous system is fundamentally a mesh. And we need both, you know, to operate, you know, and fundamentally, you know, certain hierarchical things have to happen, the decision trees or whatever.
Now, I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here and say, well, I've learned along the way. I always heard the term esoteric and didn't really understand what it was. And so I think I kind of do a little bit, but along the way, I learned the term exoteric. And to me, and help me if I'm missing the mark here, but the exoteric is more the dogmatic, and it's, you know, here's the guidelines, here are the rules, play within these rules. Millions of people have lived good, productive lives in that structure. And then comes a guy like Dennis Tardan and me saying, well, why? You know, why? You know, why is this? You know, why do I have to stay within the lines? And we look at things a little bit differently and get more into the mystical side of it. So I kind of equate the exoteric and the esoteric to the hierarchy versus the other as well.
Yes, this is Dennis. Thank you. This is tremendously stimulating. Just a couple of pieces that I'm thinking about to add into the mix here. One is that for me, the the hierarchy, as it's been understood, has one of its primary intentions to disempower the individual. And compassion, for me, includes empowering the other, whoever it is. And one way that the other can be empowered is to be authentically witnessed. One doesn't have to say anything, but when the other, and I'm just from my own experiences, both in the classroom witnessing students who are wrestling with an idea to articulate, and also to feel that what I'm having to offer is being witnessed authentically as well. And compassion also implies for me a sense of forgiveness. And perhaps self-forgiving is where it begins. And then the ability to forgive others, I find very empowering. And the last thing I want to mention is the place of patience within this dynamic, because I think it's fiercely dynamic what we're speaking about. So those are just a few pieces about what the hierarchy does that is so dispiriting. And as David pointed out, and I think it's a valid point, maybe part of the trade-off is, yeah, but I'm in a familiar world. And I know who's around me, who's above me, and how I'm supposed to behave. But taken to too far an extreme, one's purpose, one's individual purpose for being on the planet, I think can dissolve. And that's, I think, always a danger, and it's always a tension. So just a few ideas to add to this very rich conversation.
I like the word tension, because I think, Clay, that's what I heard you and Dennis talking too, is it's this tension that we're in. And maybe that's why we're having this conversation. And as men, the tension, I won't speak for the rest of you guys, but for myself, the tension between this, the head and the heart, and how does one be fully male and masculine in a Superman driven culture, but at the same time be tender and empathetic and present. And maybe that's part of the tension. And
Yeah, I ran into this in Kenya. I had 20 some odd young fellows, 18 to 35. And here I am, white Western male. I'm over there to go over there and teach them how to go into their heart. And I think about that for a minute, that possibly was a setup. But when I went over there, the first thing I said was, look, who am I, a privileged white Western male, to come over here and teach you anything? And I got down on my knees so I could be eyeball to eyeball with him. I said, I'm here to share and to learn. And what I think I'm seeing is you're warriors. And you've got that sword, and there's a time for that sword, but you're wasting your energy by pushing all this down, this other, and you're actually going out there with one hand tied behind your back. Yes, the sword, but the other is the hand of compassion. Now you can be a complete warrior. Now, my hope is that it's not the sword, that it's, debate or another way to protect, but the metaphor works. And in another way, we got into the tension. I really like that term, and help me out, but this notion of holding the tension of opposites, and within being able to hold the tension of opposites, and where the richness is in between. And that's also between people. Dennis Tardan and I can spend all day long beating each other up, trying to convince each other, or we can aim at something up here together. We can hold that tension of opposites and leverage that, the diversity that we both have, that we can bring to it, and aim at something greater than either one of us, and bring out something that never would have happened otherwise. So I love the word tension, and that's what's come to mind for me in the last couple of years.
I think there is a part, the linguistic part. I think some centuries back, they created the word gentleman. And I think the word is there, but we have never lived up to the gentleness in it. I sometimes address my students when I enter a class, I say, gentle ladies and gentlemen, and they all laugh like it's a joke. And I mean it in a serious way. I think that even the feminist revolution of the last few decades have also emphasized on the linguistic aspect of it. But if the word gentleman or the word in my native language of Pashto, Sha'ale, which is the person worthy of praise. Other than these, in most languages, Mr., Master, there is a hierarchical distinction made where, a class distinction, which is then defined by the very primitive skills of the male warrior, which is not only creating a warrior culture, but there's also the territoriality that male warrior had to protect, which has resulted in the nation state concept, which is the standard unit of analysis, regardless of the size, regardless of whether the concept of nation literally applies to them. So I think so long as those two elements are not just dominant, but very, very much established, any effort, and I don't mean to be pessimistic, but any effort would seem to be kind of only in the margins. It might become a fad, a trend for a time, and even if it becomes a more lingering one, it probably will not affect the human lot in a meaningful way. And I'm just saying, like, when and how, and if there's, if anyone knows a formula for it, to break that monopoly of the primitive skills that, yes, we have finally realized that a woman's place is not in the kitchen, but we are still adhering to a man's place as being, a patriot, strong on defense, a warrior, a strong man, and all those other primitive skills that are there. So I think unless we do some work on the other side, where we move on from a sense of competitiveness to a sense of complementarity, a complementarity in the sense that we have to work on, on both ends. I remember back, I don't know, a few years back when Hillary Clinton was running for president, and she was saying, on day one, and that she would be ready to pick up the phone in the middle of the night and destroy the whole state of Iran and, turn it into the Stone Age and things like that. And some of my friends would say, well, but wait a minute, aren't you a feminist? Yes, but then why aren't you not supporting Hillary? I said, yeah, I'm a feminist, that's why. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, this is a man talking in a woman's body. And the norms are such that she is expected to. Mm-hmm. If she is to be successful, she has to wear the man's mantle, act like it, make promises and commitments for destruction, and the value. The feminine values are totally marginalized. So I think in some ways our feminism has been I don't know the right word for it, but it has been sabotaged because we want to be competitive, and in the process of being competitive, we have lost the feminine values.
The leaders of the countries that have most successfully dealt with COVID have been women. This is an important leadership skill because it's talking about leading at levels of complexity, dealing with compromise and dealing with collaboration and dealing with work that is leading at the top and being part of this process. The same way where we're needing to heal the planet. The people that are doing this are the people that are exhibiting the skills of nurturing and seeding and replenishing and doing the work that we're doing, as opposed to extracting and taking. And those are the things that we're learning. And what Clay and I have been looking at and finding around is that there is a hunger within men that is natural. There's a hunger within men to relate with both our head and heart, that if we speak to that hunger, it will arise, but it needs nurturing, it needs modeling, and it needs expression.
I'm going to pick up on that. One of the most hierarchical organizations that I was in the Marine Corps, but that's also where servant leadership was instilled. You know, the what is it, John 15:13, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friend. That speaks every bit of compassion. You know, the Marine that's thrown himself on the grenade, he didn't think about it, but he saved his friends. The principles of servant leadership that were instilled in me and that I saw work had to do with pushing decisions down as low in the organization as possible, because it's the fellow out on the field who knows what's going on. Give him the ability to make those decisions. There were 5 principles that stick with me to this day, and one was to create an inspired vision. The second one was to model the way, to challenge the process, to enable others to act, and encourage the heart. That, I believe, is a yes and opportunity where I've seen, I mean, the Marine Corps is about everything about heart. Now, the business that they're in is unfortunate, but that is heart, that is compassion, that is love. And sometimes, I guess, that really isn't really instilled until 2 people go through a common trauma together. Something binds them, and there's a love.
And I love the linguisticness of this, because I think of this as when we think of the police, because right now we're having a lot of work about the police and what are we going to do, when in essence, were they to both be seen as and see themselves as peace officers. Here we have exactly the same role, but linguistically they are framed. The framing is, I am a peace officer. I am here to bring peace to this situation. It changes for me the framing of how I look at it.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for such an inspirational presentation. It is just exquisite. Your story, Clay, was what I would call a soul transformation. You were on one path, and then you knew you came to a crossroads. You either had to move or your life would change forever. And that was very touching. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to talk about compassion. I love the word. And I see compassion as a spiritual practice. I see compassion as wisdom. I see compassion as acceptance of self and others. it has so many qualities for both men and women. And so the part that I'm concerned about is, I think what you guys are onto is fabulous. And I'm loving that it's, you know, it's mature men, but I am very, very concerned for the children that are growing up. And the parents don't teach compassion to their children. I know, because they sit in my office. They don't even know what the word means. So another question or aspects of this is, how can parents, or how can you guys teach parents how to teach compassion to the up and upcoming children? Because they have no clue. They are hyper attached to social media. Compassion doesn't really exist in the way, because they haven't had yet the experiences. So what do you suggest for parents?
I don't know that I'm qualified to even try to answer that. I am aware that, you know, young boys have no father figure more times than not, and that they become, in the absence of a father figure, and both at home and then at school, most of the teachers being women, they become hyper masculine, where they, okay, this is what Rambo does, this is what so-and-so does, you know, that's what it is to be a man. And so they go hyper masculine because they've not had the judgment, the perspective by the mature male. And until we can bring that back into the fold in some way, I don't know. I do know this, that as I'm talking to different people around the world, and we're doing our podcast with people in Australia and Tasmania and Rwanda and so forth, there's an incredible number of men's organizations out there. Incredible number of them. And they're all intention for the greater good. And I'm witnessing one Facebook group. It's got 5,000 men in it. And what's nice is that it's a mix of ages. And so there's mentoring that goes on. And, you know, and it's and Dennis, this is Brett Chernin and his organization that based out of Australia. And these are men all around the world. So using social media to engage that conversation, but that just scratches the surface.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm that I'm really concerned about is the media, because it's built on clicks. So it's built on making sure that we get whatever it is that I can keep your eyes for the longest millisecond on my page, which is my business model. What it leaves out is all the wonderful things that are happening in the world. And there is a lot going on that is going right in the world. There is more peace. There are more people that are going from $1 a day to $2 a day. That's what I believe is the reason why we've had this worldwide, the longest amount of economic growth in the history of humanity, is because going from the laws of large numbers, $1 a day to $2 a day to $4 a day, and getting people just to the subsistence level, handing a smartphone to somebody that can find water, that can work to be able to do so many things are happening, but these stories don't get told. So it's really important that we search them out. And that's what Clay and I have been doing, is searching in search of the new compassionate male, to be able to search for this in all of us. So where are those places where we are nurturing, where are we bringing this aspect of ourselves to where I see each person as my fellow companion on this journey and treat them as such, so that we can all move forward together.
Thank you.
I wanted to give, to come into this by starting with another receipt for what Selina said, share a personal story of my own. I remember it's one of these few childhood memories that's really kind of sticks with you. I remember being in first grade. I remember being in a boys' room with a bunch of first graders. And I don't know why I said it. I don't know what we were talking about, but I remember saying, yeah, my dad taught me that you're supposed to love everybody. And all the boys in the bathroom laughing at how crazy that was.
Mm-hmm.
First graders, first grade boys, laughing me out of the bathroom at the idea that we're supposed to love everybody, because that's what my compassionate father taught me. That was a real experience. That's really how that went. But another thing that's interesting about that to me is that, you know, Peter Pan is one of my favorite characters. And one of the things interesting about Peter Pan is that if you look closely at him, he's actually, I mean, he's a true puer, but he's not like very moral or compassionate, especially early on. And so one of the things it gets at is that sometimes young boys have to grow hearts. And that's one of these things you see with the young boys sometimes have to grow hearts. And sometimes this has to do with the integration of a repressed feminine. I don't know what it is, but that's part of what you're seeing with Peter Pan, is the need to sometimes grow into that compassion.
I wanted to circle back on something I heard earlier, and I don't want to misunderstand. We get back to language. I think for me, it's important in the conversation to really make distinctions between archetypal masculine and archetypal feminine, and not conflate men and women in that space. Not only for our conversation, but particularly, I have a lot of younger friends who wouldn't identify as either male or female anyway. So there's this whole different way of talking about who we are as individuals now. But I also heard something I think that was somewhat derogatory of women accidentally, and I don't think that was meant to be derogatory, but that women may not be warriors or have a warrior element that's extremely feminine and has nothing to do with being masculine. So I give you an example of my own life. I'm my mother's first child, and when she had me, I mean, my mother grew up what you would call a liberal evangelical Christian, right? But when she had me, she had this incredible insight that if she had to, she could kill another human being if they were going to potentially harm her baby. So there's no compassion for the person she'd be killing. And that's not a masculine trait. I think that would be, or a man trait. It'd be discrediting her as a woman who has this maternal instinct or whatever it is. But she shared this story that she knew she could kill another human being, and she had never thought about that. It never occurred to her. But now that she was a mother and had this baby that needed her, she had this awareness and insight. So I want to tag that because I think it's important when we're talking about these as archetypes. And I also heard something about women doing a better job with handling COVID. Well, New Zealand, you know, is given as an example a lot. And I'm not going to say that the Prime Minister of New Zealand is not a great leader, but I think we have to put this stuff in context. I mean, New Zealand has about 4 million people, and LA County has 12 million, right? So, and my brother Steve, who lives in Australia, says New Zealand has a little over 4 million people, and half of them are out of the country at any given time. So that's not to disparage at all, but I think we want to be careful not to say that because she's a woman, she's doing a great job. What is she doing? And this is where I get into the language of patriarchy. What is she doing that's good? I mean, what, in real world application, what works from this masculine archetype and this feminine archetype?
Brilliant.
I'm a little bit more practical. So I want to know, what are we talking about in terms of real world application? How do we describe it?
Beautifully said. This is what I love, why I wanted to be in this discussion tonight. There is so much in my head that needs sharpening and clarifying and brought into that. I think I know what I'm talking about, that I think I know, but there are so many layers. When Clay and I went into the work that happened after George Floyd, there are so many levels of racism that I did not know I was going to have to go through, that were levels of conscious and unconscious biases that I had to go through. And as Clay did and so many of the men in the work that we're doing are going through. This is why I wanted to be here tonight, because I need it. I need you. I need your help.
To respond in a way to David's comment, yes, New Zealand may not be as popular as LA County, but when you look at the, I think there were 6 countries. One was Singapore, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, and Germany that were headed by women. And all those countries had very, comparatively safer or protected environment in the epidemic. Then you could also compare Germany, which is the most populated country in Europe. And yet it was much more successful compared to smaller countries who were headed by men with these, very, very arrogant attitudes. You could also look at it in a kind of a cultural sense. I remember some time ago, I saw one of the leaders of Japan who was caught with some sort of a crime, whatever it was. He came to the podium and apologized, and he was crying and weeping and crying. Something we will never see in a Western culture. Any leader do that, I mean, it will be very destructive to their quote-unquote career. Now, and in that sense, I think then when you compare the response to COVID in Korea, in Japan, and in China, and they are very populated countries, and they were very successful. And I think that speaks, I mean, there is some cultural attitude, and I don't know how to describe it. But we have to look into that and see what is it that they did it right. The only country in the East, and I mean Eastern Asia, that didn't follow the trend was India, that had as an arrogant a leader in Modi as we have in the United States, and look where it stands. So I think there might be certain cultural values that may or may not be fashionable if we use the Western cultural value as a standard, that could be brought into the fore. And I'm not recommending, but I don't think there's anything wrong if a leader makes a mistake and comes out and apologizes and shows his sincerity by weeping and crying, which shows that, yeah, the person really means it.
We would need forgiveness to be an accepted value, to be able to support that type of a compassionate way of being.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
Boy, I so appreciate what you're saying, Zaman. One of the things that we learned in visiting with a colleague in Rwanda, he was born in the UK, grew up in the US, and international leadership consulting. And Rwanda, some 26, 27 years ago, the genocide that was horrific. The leader of the country, one of the first things he did was said, we've got to educate the women. And in that process, fast forward to today, and 2/3 of their parliament are women. And now there's more of a, I think, a nationalistic, they're not quite as individualistic as we are. But when COVID came out, they shut things down and they said, hey, this is how we're going to go. And everybody fell in line and did it. At the time that we talked, there were 5 COVID cases in Rwanda, and 3 of them had been imported.
I just want to go back to that movie, because that's what we saw with the mother. One of them gets sick or gets the thing on his face, and all the men give the masculine value, all for one, one for all, get him in here, save our guy. And the mother gives the mother's value. Leave him out because I want to save my family. Don't let him in here. And it's a different response. And I think you see that set up right at the outset of that movie.
First, I really want to thank you for wrestling with masculine subjectivity and how necessary it is that we come to grips with it. And what I want to ask you about is you began by talking about the tension of the opposites, which I think is vitally important, that needs to be discussed. So given that, could you talk more about the deep feminine and the dark feminine that's part of your logic? And the reason why is not that it's this easy liberal, well, I want to accept women. It's more the fact that, for example, you argue that both men and women are wounded, and I believe that. But women's woundedness is structural in a way that man's woundedness is not. What do I mean by that? Right, in terms of the Western mindset, if we look at Adam and Eve, right, the whole notion that she is from his rib. So we don't have the love story, we have the Eve story of a kind of acceptable femininity. And Mary Beard, who writes about women in power, discusses Homer's The Odyssey, which I love. But even that is based on, if we look at Telemachus, while his mother is fending off all these suitors, he tells her to shut up and to go back into her room. This is man stuff, right? So if you think about a book like Women Who Run with the Wolves, the feminine already has this quality, right, of possibility. It's a fierce feminine, but in order for that to come out, it has to be connected to darkness. It has to be connected to power in ways that men just aren't used to accepting. So I understand what you mean by compassion, and I like what Dennis said about it. But if you look up the etymology of the word compassion, it begins with literally suffering with another, not suffering for another, suffering with. So if you could do some more talking about the feminine and how that, because I don't want to say one more thing. You're right. Make one more point. You're right about this. You're making me think about the emergence of the compassionate male. In Ion, Jung argued that the new emerging paradigm would be the feminine. And the way he based that on rhizomatic thinking, not the thinking of a tree, but a rhizome, like you said, a nodal, a network. And I'll stop here. He ended his memory, dreams, and reflections with, if everything else goes away, all that remains is the rhizome. And the rhizome is a radical feminine. So that tension you're talking about, I think that's a good way to bring the deep feminine into it, because males can't be compassionate, in my view, unless we really wrestle with this notion of the deep feminine and women when they have power and how we respond to that and how I respond to that.
Yeah, and I'm not going to do it justice, the question, because it's a big question. But what occurs to me, it goes back to what Dana was talking about the lunar masculine, the solar masculine, the lunar feminine, the solar feminine. Dr. Karambu from Kenya, wonderful woman. You know, she said, you men have got to work to embrace your divine feminine energy, and the women have got to work to embrace their divine male energy, masculine energy. That's and it's interesting because in my experience has been that I always hear about, you guys have got to go into your heart, and the guys think, oh yeah, leave my head behind. I'm not going to do that. That's not what they're meaning. Let's integrate. But it's always about the man going into his heart. Where is it that you hear about the women owning her solar? And I kind of think that's what you're getting at, that that is a place. But when she steps up, you know, so oftentimes in the boardroom, as she steps up into that power, she's a bitch.
Okay, well, that makes sense to me. So let me make the question smaller.
Thank you, Vorris.
Please.
I thought it was small, but I'll re-ask it.
Okay.
If we're going to talk about the teaching of the opposites in male compassion, then we need to talk about women in power and how they are structurally excluded.
Yeah.
Right, from certain kinds of behaviors. And let's stick with what you said about the bitch trope, right? Senator Ted Yoho or Ho-Ho, or whatever his name is, right, called Representative Alexandra Ortega-Cortez, and forgive me if I got a middle name wrong, he called her a bitch. Why? Because she has power. She was not kowtowing to male acceptance, and he couldn't stand it. So he had to call her a bitch. Question, I think it's a question grounded in the everyday, actually.
Well, one of the things that I'm hoping that Selina you can give us some perspective on, because what I know back in I guess I was in my 20s, and there was a movie called Death Trap. Mm-hmm. And Christopher Reeve and Michael Caine, two of my heroes, were in this movie, and it was a murder mystery movie. And Christopher Reeve was Superman. I mean, this was the height of what masculinity is, and here was Michael Caine, this debonair British, and I'm sitting in the movie theater, and they kiss. I was shocked. I couldn't believe here I was, even though my mother was in the theater and had gay friends and all, I had no idea that I would have this visceral reaction to this happening. So fast forward to today, we're getting an opportunity to see women in these power structures, and we're having these visceral reactions to it. I can tell you now that when I watch Glee and I watch the two male characters, I've forgotten their names, kiss, I can actually in my heart go, isn't that sweet? I could not have done that before. It has taken a while for me to grow emotionally, to be able to grow enough to be able to have those kinds of reactions. Do you think so, Selina? Do you see a growth process happening?
Absolutely. Yes, I absolutely do. And I think what you're saying, Dennis, is it is a process. And I think it's a shock initially because our family set us in certain patterns, and then we follow that. And if anything goes out of the patternage and we don't have a way for it, we are shocked. But because of the intensity of all the different forms of streaming, television, Facebook, TikTok, we are hit at such a level right now that we've never been in the history of the world. So where this is going to go, I don't know. But we are called right now to process things at a very different frequency or vibration than we ever have.
How do you see that, Selina? I love that, because to me, we're getting down to practical applications. Forgive me, I'm just practical. Why talk about the compassionate male? Except for our own healing, who cares? So when you talk about, Selina, where we are and sort of I hear the need for this, please speak more to that, because I'm feeling that as well, but I'd like to see how you see that playing out.
I'm not sure the question that you're asking.
So the need for I think this different way of being in the world and experiencing the world. I think we're all feeling like whatever we're doing now isn't going to carry the freight for much longer. So where do you, from your perspective as a therapist, see movement? Movement
for men is going to be very different, of course, than movement for women. I think, and I'm going to agree with the direction that you, Clay, and Dennis are going, it is heart-centered. It is all about the heart. It is opening up the heart chakra. And I think that and acceptance, that is the key. And compassion is absolutely part of that. I think the heart opening is the key. It's the key for love. I think love is in a healing archetype that transcends everything. So I'm looking at that from that perspective: heart, chakra, compassion, to really embrace that in each life, whether it's men or women. But for the men, compassion, heart opening leads to transformation. And the heart opening can be through a relationship. It can be through kindness. It can be through mentoring. I mean, however the heart has to open, it doesn't matter the way. It matters that it opens, and that you have to do something different than you normally do. Because if you're doing the same thing over and over, you're not going to get to it. You've got to step out of yourself and go to a different aspect of yourself. Otherwise, change will not occur.
I just had a thought, and we're talking, Dennis and I, the new compassionate male. What put me on that path was when I went to the Parliament of the World's Religions in the fall of 2018. And I was visiting with the board chair for the Charter for Compassion. And I said, look here, there literally are 10,000 people up here. 10,000 from all these religious traditions all over the world. Hundreds of sessions that are going on. And I looked through the book and looked through all the sessions. And I said, Charlie, there's not one session on men. And then I said, the Charter for Compassion has got these 12 initiatives. And the last one is women and girls. Where's the initiative for men? Now, we're the elephant in the room. I mean, face it, okay? And so that's where I have really narrowed and said, okay, let's work on the men and compassion element, because the rest of the world are working with, all the rest of it. But we men have got to get our stuff together. I'm going to step out with a generality. From my experience, I believe what I've seen is women being a bit more conscious than men. And so for us to be on equal footing, let's bring the woman down. That's not going to work. We guys have got to come up like this. And that's work men have got to do with men. And it's not running naked in the woods. It's in a caring, nurturing environment, safe environment, so that we can begin to work and find that language and practice that in a circle without judgment, and recognize that we guys are on the same plane so much. I mean, with variation, but that's so systemic. And so that we can become more conscious, so that we can come together on equal level. So my view in looking at and trying to describe or embrace the overall picture, I haven't tried to do that. I've tried to stay, let's get the men thing worked out, because we're the elephant in the room.
May I make one short observation, because I know we want to get the audience in, and I want to be brief. But just to finish, and David, to respond to you with the practical, which I also feel an impulse towards, what we have said, if I'm remembering Jung correctly, what we have said about holding the tension of opposites is absolutely true. But Marion Woodman, just a superb Jungian analyst, said, yes, we have the capacity to hold the tension of opposites. And she'd always have her hands up and a little space between them. And we hold the tension, and we hold the tension until a third thing emerges, which Jung called the tertium quid, the third thing. So I just wanted to add that to this rich metaphor, because there's I think a tremendous practicality in learning the patience and endurance to hold that tension. And then I think it's an act of faith that some third thing will emerge that is what Jung called the transcendent function. And it's a marriage between the two sides of the tension, and it's the birth of the new.
It does seem to me that we are faced with the call for new mythologies, that we have to come up with new paradigms, not necessarily uncover new archetypes, because the archetypes have always been there. But, you know, as Campbell said, we do need, this is a time to create new mythologies, and maybe your compassionate male is one of those. And I might suggest that, you know, a big part of that is being vulnerable, being humble, being accessible, showing ourselves to be open to new solutions, new ways of being, and not always needing to govern ourselves by goals and outcomes and profit and all of the kinds of things that typically define a material, consumer-based kind of identity and reality. You know, one of the things that I want to play off on is what Dennis Tardan mentioned in the very beginning of his comments about our being interconnected. Humanity as a species and we as individuals are born into the world interconnected. We're deeply implicated in the ways and beings of one another. In fact, when a child is born, is inseparable from the mother, and it's not until they actually become separated that the whole idea of individual self starts to take form. And the problem with this is that that is the start of patriarchy. That's the start of where this whole issue of control starts to come in, both at a cultural and individual level. And we have to contrive ways of being that kind of allow patriarchy its place. What tends to happen is that we go with our left brain and we start thinking about stuff and we start reasoning and we start developing that capacity for interpretation in name giving and symbol making and all of the things that put the world into its rational frames of reference. We just finished a project with David Bohm called The Infinite Potential. And the physicists are now coming up with the whole reality of understanding oneness from actually a scientific standpoint. And what we're finding is that the oneness that we left at the very beginning is now the oneness to which we're returning. So we're going through this whole odyssey, and the one healing element may be compassion. As we move from oneness at the beginning to oneness at the end, what we really have is the ability to be compassionate, to nurture those interconnections that we feel with one another. And we can feel it in our relational capacities. And whether you're masculine or feminine, or you're a male or a female, when we're in a relationship, that relationship is that third thing. That's the thing that we begin to nurture, and the compassion is what keeps it alive. Here's Howard. Now, Howard approached me about a little over a year ago to help write develop a project about the lunar masculine and the solar feminine. And I had not really heard those words at that time. And I really started working with it, and I found that both of the archetypes, whether they're solar or lunar, have paired opposites. Howard calls them two-ness. And two-ness was something that it goes way back in terms of philosophy and religious studies and what have you. But maybe we could let Howard talk. Howard, can we hear you? Hear your voice.
Thank you. Yeah, this is such a surprisingly powerful seminar for me, having been very trained in Jungian archetypal psychology and feeling stuck in the definition of the anima, and having to actually follow Joseph Campbell's earliest thing he wrote in 1943, the twin hero mythology, the Navajo twin hero mythology. And to my shock, I found that every pre-Judeo-Christian culture had twin males in their architecture and labeled that by the cultures, not Cain and Abel, not brothers, but twins. And through a deep search that I went through to figure this out for my own sanity, I came across the Mayan myth of the twins who face the ball court and they win, and they're making too much noise for the lords of the underworld, so they go down there and they actually defeat them, and but they realize they're mortal, so they have to jump into a fire, and one is born as the sun and one is born as the moon. And that was my wake-up call to all these different twin male mythologies, pre-Judeo-Christian culture, because it was Romulus who kills the twin Remus. And so that what you get is this distorted architecture of the masculine. And so I've written about this and done a bunch of stuff on it. And where I had to get past was, this is going to be controversial, the feminine side of men, and seeing if you really got to the quantum physics label of reflective consciousness, reflection, or the wave, and you got to the particle, you got beyond gender. And that was the real wake-up call for me to develop another part of my masculinity, which for me was actually the solar male. And that was what was more wounded in me than the lunar male, which was very internal. But on and on and on I could go. So where I had to really liberate myself from is the, Jung's definition of the masculine, which is the anima, the way he defines it. I know there's a bunch of new work being done, but to really operate at this at the quantum level of wave and particle and see what men and women with the consciousness that this group and other groups have, I think is a revolution to look for two-ness rather than oneness and hierarchy, where they're actually entangled at the level of, at the quantum level until they emerge. And it's when they emerge to be able to have the reflective consciousness to combine it with its complement, not its opposite only.
Nice, Howard.
I'm so interested in this particle wave conversation, and it brings in one of the really important things. We've heard a couple people use the word individualism. It is one of the things we typically can associate with patriarchy or hypermasculinity is hyper-individualism. And whether or not that's true, that's one of the things that comes up. And the atom, the particle, is hyper-individualized. And so if you build your whole worldview around an atomistic worldview, then you're going to project that back at yourself. All of our values are going to be based on atomism. Memes, it's just another translation of atomism. So atomism, when our cultural values are built on a paradigm of everything being individual, of course, we're all going to be individualistic. And, when you integrate the wave, you're integrating something that has a different metaphor. The wave is the elixir, is the feminine when we drink it in the form of the Holy Grail, is what's being imbibed and integrated. And the elixir, the wave, we've talked about this, Howard, water, or sound waves, we all play different musical instruments, then a single microphone can record that as a single wave. If we all throw our sand in the middle of the room, it will not converge, it will not combine. Things cannot do that, atoms cannot do that, but waves absolutely can have no problem with oneness and manyness. And so when you end up with the particle wave duality, you end up with the paradoxical duality between something that's totally individual and something that's totally everything, indivisible, capable of being one and many. I don't know, I want to appreciate Howard bringing in those paradigms, those concepts to this conversation.
Here's a question, Clay and Dennis, in your experience, and it goes, I think, to what you're talking about, the subatomic level, Will, but going back to the tension, how do we as males, if we're talking about a compassionate male paradigm, I think one of the fears that I have in my gut is compassion is weak, vulnerability is weak, openness is weak. And in my heart, that feels good, but I live in a world surrounded by other people who will pounce on that weakness, either in a workspace or a relationship, or now in the culture that we're in. So how, from your experience and the work you're doing with men, how do we have this, what I would call strong compassion or deep masculine male? It's a strength, not a weakness.
What I go back to my time in the Marine Corps. There was nothing weak about us. Not a damn thing. We were the toughest. And we were compassionate. So I would, at the time wearing my Marine Corps uniform, I'd defy anybody to call me weak. And they could call me compassionate, but not weak. So that's kind of a frame of reference that I've got. And I know that that's not the typical, because I agree. It's compassion is weak. Somebody said on our podcast the other day, I grew up thinking that compassion was petting puppy dogs. Remember that, Dennis?
Yeah, I sure do. And one of the things, David, is that what I found is, what is the value of the assist? Like Wayne Gretzky, the greatest scorer in the history of hockey, also had the greatest number of assists. What do you get the value of making some other person great? Some other team great? What is the value in you doing that? And when we dig into there, compassion comes out, because it comes for both the greater good, the good of the organization, but the person gets the joy of nurturing and seeing another person grow and get stronger, another team, another issue, another value grow and get stronger. And it gives them the opportunity to be able to see that as a value add as opposed to a weakness.
If I can jump in, I wanted to reconnect back with the point that Vorris raised earlier in regards to the greater myths that we have. And he was talking about how, in the story of creation, or in the Garden of Eden, Eve is created from Adam's rib, and she's held responsible for the whole thing. Now, when you come to the Quranic version of that, there is no Eve. There's just Adam, and Adam is androgynous. And when the forbidden fruit is consumed, the dialogue with the God is answered in a dual form in the Arabic language, that the two of us did it unto ourselves, and they asked for forgiveness. And in a way, you would look at that in the process of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, that this was a revision, a reform, changing the whole narrative, trying to get this whole narrative, the myth, get rid of the feminine being victimized and all that. Well, that all sounds wonderful. But in the matter of a few decades, when a whole lot of Christians and Jews converted into Islam, the dominant Islamic cultural narrative today is not a Quranic narrative. It is a Judeo-Christian narrative. The name of Eve has entered back into the dialogue. They named their children Eve, and all the rest of the story, everything is in there. The reason I'm mentioning this is that, yes, let's imagine that Prophet Muhammad and the Quran came as a reform to make the changes that were necessary to stop the victimization of the feminine and all that. Yes, but then this misogynist mindset very stubbornly comes back and take the center stage. And now when you go to most of the Islamic culture, 98.3221% of them are all thinking same as along the Judeo-Christian tradition. And you would say that, okay, why are they so misogynistic if the Quran is speaking that way? And I'm saying that, yes, but they are not Quranic Muslims, at least in this regard. The Muslims of today are more Judeo-Christian than they are Muslims, when it comes to these values. So my concern is that, yes, we can have reforms, even such reforms that could be divine as the Quran is perceived, and yet the society will stubbornly hang on to the value system that was there, and it would seem like if nothing had happened.
I think you're right about that, and I appreciate that intervention. Where I'm having some resistance is that oftentimes the practical hides the status quo. And if to talk about these issues, to not talk about power is very much a problem, one. And let's go back to Wells' intervention around the particle. What's interesting about that observation, right, as Will knows, whether it's a particle or a wave depends upon observation, the instrument that's being observed, et cetera, et cetera. And when you're making comments like what the heart will do and that things are getting better, you then ask the rhetorical question, for whom? Who believes that? Who thinks that? And I can give you a list of folks who don't think things are getting better, right? In this country, things are getting worse for the poor. It's getting worse for the middle class. So I understand the importance of individuation. That's why I'm in this with this group. But the practical, and to not talk about power, is something that needs to be addressed. Not here, and as you said, it's larger, but how can you not talk about it when you're talking about individuation and liberation?
Hear, hear.
And it's so amazing the way that what was the big thing in a lot of these dystopian novels is that we internalize the power and we give it a voice inside of ourselves. So even if we're talking about the psyche, you know, we still need to talk about the power out there because we're likely to be internalizing it as our own set of voices.
Well, and here's my bias sometimes around compassion, and I'm not saying that it applies to anybody here, but it can be a cop-out from action. And one of the things I think that happens to it, so this would be an indictment against those of us who are privileged, who have the time to contemplate our navels, is while we're doing our own inner work, we might remove ourselves from a world that needs us to be engaged. And not all engagement is compassion. I mean, the people in the streets this summer are angry. That's not compassion. It's rage and it's hurt. And that's action. And a friend of mine is an attorney, and he was sharing with his daughter a conversation we were having because she's 14 and she's feeling the empathy with folks who are demonstrating and the power differential you're talking about, Vorris, which is great about teenage kids because they feel it like right now. And what I shared with him and he shared with her, because it was an insight for him, because he's an attorney, he wants process, he wants to involve the heart and the head. We all get together and come to a good outcome. But these demonstrations in the streets were rubbing him the wrong way. It made him uncomfortable. And I said, well, brother, I said, what often has to happen out for change to happen is that angry people have to get angry and be pissed off. So
First, you gotta get mad, network, right?
Yeah, then the rest of us wake up. So yes, the power. And so how, if we're talking about being a compassionate male, that goes back for me, and I apologize if I'm dominating this, but I go back to the practical.
Could I?
Yeah.
Yeah. So where I connect with that was back with these young Kenyans. You know, yes, you have the sword in one hand, but you also have the hand of compassion. It's not an either or. It's a yes and. And to be able to hold and have the discernment and the judgment to show up as a complete male, fully integrated, I didn't put down the sword.
So you use the sword if necessary.
Well, in fact, the hero only gets to claim the sword after, when done properly, after that ego death has occurred first. To suffer with compassion, to suffer with, you can't be a hero unless it's with and for. You know, it's got to be with and for. You know, and so you only get to get that special sword. The bow should only fall off easily for you if that's where you are.
Well, and you know, for me, I think of empathy as to sit with someone, and compassion is, yes, to sit with someone and take action, to take action. And the people that are in rage are showing compassion to me, from my vantage point, through their rage for their.
The people who are marching and protesting and doing what they're doing as an example of showing compassion are having compassion for the people that they are a part of who aren't there. You know, there are a lot of people, when I look at these they're not demonstrations, they've put their lives in action. They've pushed from the side of the pool out into the middle of the fray, and it's a place where they can get hurt, but they have to risk and trust that this is actually something that reflects the true sense and nature of their being. That means that they're tied to the people back home, their friends, the community they're a part of, and putting themselves often at great risk to do that.
They're laying down their life for their friend.
For their friend.
Or maybe they're willing to die for their kids.
Same thing. I mean, same.
Yeah.
I do like the fact that you bring up practicality, David. I'm not against pragmatism. I'm just arguing that it's cultural. I have a good friend who's Kenyan, and he tells me all the time that I'm too busy trying to help people, and sometimes the way you help them is by allowing them to suffer so they can individuate. And I think from his perspective, makes a good point. So I just wanted to add that I think I'm struggling with the practical, but I also want to understand that our observations come from particular perspectives, and we have to take that into account if we really want to be compassionate.
You know, Karambu, she's in Meru, Kenya, and that's who hosted me out there last year. And she said, I don't want your money. I don't want that help. You know, that's colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to help me, come over here. Let's work together. Let's go work together. And that really helped me out, helped put things into perspective. So I agree, Morris.
I think this might be a really appropriate place to bring our Myth Salon today, you know, to a conclusion.
Socrates never comes to a conclusion at the end of any of his dialogues. This topic is gargantuan. Are we talking about, you know, the masculine? Are we talking about the feminine? Are we talking about inequality in the world between men and women? You can't talk about it all in 2 hours, and I appreciate your focus on the masculine and the integration of what the masculine needs to add in. But so I just want to say just a quick note to say, obviously this topic is way bigger than we can ever cover. And, you know, it's an honor just to talk about it, knowing we probably aren't going to come to any more conclusions than a Socratic dialogue.
The singing bowl that I bring up, it may make a sound, but it comes from silence. And when we start from silence and we return to silence, it is as if we're awakening the call of our ground of being. So if we can, again, think of the 7.5 million people who have been affected by the coronavirus pandemic that we're in, and the 210,000 plus people who have given their lives for this, who have lost the ability to give but can receive compassion. Let's have a moment of silence right now, please. Clay, Dennis, it has really been an absolute pleasure to continue our journey together. I love that I was able to come on to your program and be interviewed by you. It awakened more things than you can possibly imagine in me. the things that I think about that we want to work on, I call them, the four things that are really central to me, which are imagination, adaptability, coordination, and humility. Imagination. We have to look out there and find something that we don't see that's out there. And adaptability is just the changing circumstances that are coming to us on a daily and moment by moment basis. But the coordination is to be able to reach for that and be able to hit it with everything that we've got going. And humility is just knowing that we really don't have that much to do with it. It's about achieving that compassion, that oneness with whatever it happens to be. So I want to thank everybody who showed up as participants in the panel tonight. David, my good friend, you're just the best. On that note, I'm just going to wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for coming and joining Clay and Dennis and in our search for the new compassionate male. Bless you all.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you all.
What an honor.
Dennis.
Thanks, Clay and Dennis.
Thank you.